so we are going to move on now to our very distinguished panel that we have this morning. We're going to take a closer look at taxes, spending, and the budget, how the proposals will impact the business community and the TwinWest region and beyond. So I'm going to start by introducing, we have Senator Julianne Ortman. She is the chair of the Minnesota Senate Tax Committee. She's the Tax Committee's 34th chair since statehood and the first woman. Elected in 2002, Senator Ortman currently represents the 10 cities and 11 townships comprising District 34, which includes Carver and northwestern Scott counties. She has served as a member of the Judiciary, Transportation Policy and Finance, Tax, Crime Prevention, Public Safety Finance, Economic Development, and Elections Committees. She lives in the beautiful city of Chanhassen with her husband and 4 children. So please join me in welcoming Senator Ortman. We also have this morning Representative Paul Marquart. Representative Marquart is serving in his 6th term as state representative from District 9B, representing Wilkin, Traverse, and Southern Clay counties in west central Minnesota. He serves on the Taxes, Property, and Local Taxes and Redistricting Committees in the Minnesota House. He is in his 27th year as a social studies teacher at Dilworth Glendon Felton High School. He is married to Colleen, and they have 2 children, Lindsay and Ashley, who are both in the teaching profession. So please join me in welcoming Representative Marquart. We also have this morning Mark Haveman. Mark is the executive director of the Minnesota Taxpayers Association, a nonprofit, nonpartisan, membership-based organization dedicated to promoting transparent, accountable government and sound tax policy. He joined the organization in 2002 as part of an effort to revitalize the research and education arm of MTA, the Minnesota Tax Foundation, now called the Minnesota Center for Public Finance Research. He became MTA's executive director in 2008. Mark was also a member of the then Governor Palenti's 21st Century Tax Reform Commission and currently serves on the Board of Trustees in the Governmental Research Association. So please join me in welcoming Mark Haveman. Great. Yeah, and I will just tell you the microphones always have to be closer than you would expect them to be. So if you start to taste the metal on it, you're probably close enough to it. So kind of move that around. So just make sure, and maybe if folks in the back, when they do, if you can't hear, let's just let them know that sooner so that we can all hear their comments. So here we are. We have 10 days remaining in the legislative session. The state is facing a $5 billion budget deficit, as we mentioned. And while the beginning of the session was marked with agreement on key pieces of legislation, the pace has fallen off a little bit for passing legislation. As we all know, the Republicans are in control of the House and the Senate. We have the DFL in charge of the administration. And we don't appear to have an imminent deal at hand, unless something broke last night that we all missed about. Okay, so, right, and the disagreement, I think, where we haven't really reached agreement on is whether or not the state has a revenue problem, whether the state has a spending problem, or if it's a degree of combination. So let's start by tackling that issue. I feel like I'm really far behind you guys, so don't worry, you don't have to look at me, just listen. So let's start with that question. So does the state of Minnesota have a spending problem, a revenue problem, or a combination of both? And Mark, why don't we start with you on that?
I was really counting on having these 2 go first on that one. Is this on?
Yeah.
All right. I would argue both, and for these reasons. On the revenue side, obviously we're coming out of some of the most extraordinary economic circumstances this country has seen in a very long time. And as our state economists and our state demographers noted in their travels around the state, it has created more or less a sort of a permanent decline that it's a hole in the revenue system that's very difficult to get out of. So clearly on the revenue side, we're always going to be trying to backfill from what has transpired over the past several years. On the spending side, we also have some extraordinary challenges based on the demographic slug that the state is facing. A lot has been made about spending levels and their growth in the state. It's also important to note that a lot of that is on autopilot as a result of an aging demographic and all the expenditures that are associated with senior populations. That's only going to increase over time. The Health and Human Service budget continues to explode, and a lot of that is based on current law. Those 8, 9, 10, 11, 12% increases are not really due to any changes in the programs oftentimes, but rather just a function of the fact we got more people heading in that direction. So our whole fiscal system on both the revenue and the expenditure side needs a much closer look. And as we argue many times, that it's not just a function of how much revenue is raised, but how the revenue is raised. And that is going to be infinitely more important as time goes on, because the same demographic features which are creating such extraordinary challenges on the spending side also have profound implications on the revenue side, and we have to tackle that.
So Senator Ortman, the Republican leadership has talked about the fact that you know, we need to cut back on the amount of money that we're spending, and $34 billion is kind of a number that is, I don't think we've seen the final number, but that's kind of a number that's been touted out. The Republicans are saying we're not spending any more than this. So is that something that we can achieve through cuts? Is that something that you think we'll end up seeing in the end?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here this morning. It's a pleasure to see you all, and it's nice to take a break from what's happening at the Capitol and hear from real folks. So thank you very much for the invitation. Let me say that we are very committed to that number, $34.2 billion, because that's how much money we have. We have a $5 billion deficit. If you remember, in November, it was scheduled to be more than that. It was $6.2 billion, but because of our new forecast, we recognize that it will be a $5 billion deficit. $34.2 billion is what we have, and we're not going to spend a penny more. Because that's what families and businesses all across the state are doing. We have to live within our means. But let me say it's not an all-cuts budget. Have you heard that? It's not true. It's a 9% increase over the last biennium, 9%. And so we think that a 9% increase with no new taxes is a very common sense proposal. We've been crippled, our economy, by overspending at the state. That $5 billion deficit didn't appear just solely because of the economic turnback. That was a very big part of it. But Mark is right. We've been relying on volatile income tax revenues. They are volatile. When something like the economy has a big turn down like it had recently, our income revenues drop. Your incomes drop in your businesses, in your home, in your family, and so the revenues to the state drop. And that's not a very reliable source of revenue for the state. And so we do need to look at our tax policy and maybe go back to some stability and making sure that we're collecting revenue in the right ways and best ways, ways that foster growth in the economy. However, that $34.2 billion is a very important part of what we see as a key portion of the fix to the economy. When we say that there's a spending problem, let me tell you how big that problem is. Since 1961, yes, that was before I was born, our state spending has increased every biennium by 17.7%. That's 8.8% every year. That's uncontrolled spending. And it keeps putting pressure on our state legislators to raise taxes. And what we're saying is, slow down, let's balance this budget. If you have an economic crisis, as we've had, you fix the immediate problem, and then you do your best to make sure it never happens again. And that's what that constitutional amendment is about, to further define what it means to have a balanced budget. It means that you don't spend beyond your means. And let me explain what I mean by that. The last legislature left a budget deficit. They made all kinds of empty promises, including the governor, the deal that they ended up with, promised a budget in this biennium of over $39 billion. With a source of revenue of less than $30 billion. That is not a balanced budget going forward. That's that structural deficit that we hear about. And so we came back to the Capitol and said, okay, we can't pass a $39 billion deficit because we don't have the sources of revenue to pay for that. The governor came in with $37 billion, but he proposes a very big tax increase to pay for that. We're saying no tax increases, live within our means, $34.2 billion, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to work on some of those reforms and perhaps a constitutional amendment, ask the citizens what they mean by a balanced budget. But we need to address this problem. We can't let it wait anymore, and we are here to tackle it, and we will draw that line clearly at $34.2 billion.
So, Representative Marquart, is $34.2 billion something that your caucus thinks is a number that the state can live with, or what is it that you're thinking of?
Well, thank you. But first of all, thank you for inviting me to be here. I feel honored to be before this group. And I just saw this area. I'm from Dilworth, so I don't make it into this area too much, but this new development is just beautiful here. And it's nice to be with my colleague on the Property Tax Division, Mr. John Benson. And this year, Representative Benson gave the best speech I heard in defense of the property tax refund program in committee. So it was just tremendous. And also, as you were reading those statistics, since I'm not your local legislator, I'm in that 1% that was ranking the 5. So that's me right here. So, well, I think, you know, when we're talking, I'm not going to, you've heard all kind of the rhetoric on both sides. And I think we're actually talking about the wrong things. You know, because we have not adjusted to the new normal, and because we have not heeded the warnings of people like Brandel and Weber, who years ago wrote a report, Living Within Our Means, and all these things talking about the upcoming demographics, they're here now. Because we haven't adjusted to a tax base that is getting narrower by the day, we wind up with the two usual suspects. And that's what we have this year: increase taxes or cut spending to deal with it. And right now, if you listen to our Toms in the state, Tom Stenson and Tom Gillespie, they say we have a $2 billion structural deficit every year into the future. That's what we have to solve. And so it's not so much a matter of do we increase taxes or reduce spending. We've got to solve that $2 billion through some sort of redesign and reform. And that's the third option that really has not been talked about enough. First of all, I don't agree $34 million is fair. Even with the governor's budget that's been proposed at $37.2 billion, that is, if you take that into account and go back 6 years, that's a 3% increase per year over the last 6 years. If you take his revenue numbers, that's a total of a 2.3% increase in the last 6 years. So I think we have both a revenue and a spending problem. But the real problem is looking at the demographics and what we have here. The Long-Term Budget Committee said that in the next 25 years, we're going to increase revenues by 3.9% a year. As Mark mentioned, health care is going up about 8.5% a year. That means that even if we wanted to increase education 2% a year, every other part of the budget would have to be decreased by 3.9% a year and basically would vanish by 2035. So, you know, both tax bills, the governor's and the Senate's and the House, and those tax bills are being constricted by just the spending side and the revenue side. And I think, and maybe we can talk about this later, that we need to really look at things differently. And, you know, we start out, and it's a partisan thing right away. I think we should go to something called a North Star budget, where we set and we go back to the price of government. That way we know what we have to spend each and every year, and it's based on a % of income. And then go to zero-based budgeting, where you sit and you start out the year talking about outcomes and results and goals, and you're not talking about the inputs. That's the way you get bipartisan views. But I think we have both problems. $34 billion is, you know, when almost all of the increase that we've seen is in health care, and most of that being care for senior citizens and those with disabilities. It simply is not enough in the short term. It's more of a long-term thing. We've got to start to redesign and reform, or we're not going to get out of this.
So, Mark, your organization looks at, it's done a number of studies looking at a number of issues, and reform and efficiency in the delivery of services. That's something we hear quite a bit of talk about. We heard more of it in the beginning of session, I think, than we're hearing now. So from what you've looked at, how much do you think is there? How much meat is on that bone for just efficiencies getting out of the budget?
As far as this session is concerned, it's a challenge, because obviously when you're talking about structural reform of major spending programs, these things have a lot of bolts and nuts and gears associated with them. And to do this right and do it carefully takes some time. That's not to say there aren't some very good ideas in play right now, and we hope that certainly they get put in place. But I think that the redesign fruits are going to be, in future bienniums as we put these sorts of things in place. When you look at the general fund budget, you're looking at three primary areas. You're looking at health and human services, you're looking at K-12 education, and property tax aids and credits. Those are the three primary areas of the general fund. Are there redesign opportunities in each of those areas? Absolutely. Are they controversial? Absolutely. One of the more interesting ones in the K-12 area that has come out this year is transforming school boards into education boards, where instead of having school districts sort of manage the process and the bureaucracy associated with school service delivery, they basically write performance contracts and allow site-based management and give schools the freedom and latitude to allocate staffing resources and financial resources in ways that deliver on those educational outcomes. Personally, I think that's one of the most profound and important types of school reform, K-12 education reform, and it has some of the biggest promise for the state. That's an extraordinarily challenging task to put that in place. But hopefully, as time goes on, and maybe the budget will drive this, we'll see more and more of those types of things happen.
Senator Ortman, ideas that you have been thinking about in reform where we can get some efficiencies, anything you want to share on that?
Absolutely. First, I would say, and congratulations to Senator Olson for her work on that Board of Education reform. She's really been a leader in the Senate in so many different ways. We are working in the tax committee. It's going to take a little longer than just the first 16 weeks here to begin real reforms, but there's so much room for real reform. And let me just talk a little bit about LGA and county program aid. These are aids and credits that are a very big portion of our budget. Almost 10% of the state's general fund budget is money that we raise in income and sales taxes, and then we distribute in the form of aids and credits through local government aid and county program aid to relieve property tax burdens. And so there's a circular problem there that we raise from the income and sales tax to buy down property taxes that have gotten too high in the local communities. One particular example, there are cities, Wadena and Winona, I believe, 64% of their cities' budgets are represented with LGA. And so we're saying the real reform there is to go back and say, should these cities be looking at a different way to provide services to their residents? Perhaps some consolidation among our 800 cities would make some sense. We have more government than we can afford. And I would say that if you look at cities, schools, counties, the soil and water boards, the Metropolitan Council, the state and the federal agencies all have programs that have duplication. And that's where the reform really needs to occur. It's in consolidation. It's in looking at who's providing these services. We have agencies that do the same thing in the state agencies that duplicate what their other agencies are doing. And so we really need to look at that and decide who's going to regulate certain aspects. For instance, water. The cities, the counties, the Soil and Water Board, the state, several state agencies, the federal agencies all regulate that. And so there really is room for the elimination of duplication of services. That's just one example, but let me give you just two more that we are working on through the interim and into the next year. We have a study outstanding on LGA. How do we best provide LGA to these cities and encourage them to have real relationships with the folks that they represent and not just foster more spending through LGA? Second, we have 55 property tax classifications in the state of Minnesota. 55. It's a nightmare in terms of its complexity, and so we are working at addressing that problem through the interim. And then we have billions of dollars in tax expenditures and exemptions where we are taking the state's money and paying it out. Some of them are refundable tax credits to folks that don't have any tax liability at all. We're writing a check. And so we need to look at those programs and say they are as much a spending program as any other government program. And we need to look at the exemptions where certain taxpayers pay and others don't. We've had decades of building into our system all of these special deals for special businesses, for special programs, and we need to look at that. And honestly, that's what Ronald Reagan did so effectively in 1986. If you remember, he lowered the income tax rates and expanded the base by eliminating special deals. And if you remember, we used to be able to write off interest in our taxes, and Ronald Reagan eliminated that. When he lowered the income tax rates, spread out the base, we actually had huge economic growth. And the state of Minnesota would definitely benefit by a review of those exemptions and the expenditures.
So a lot of issues there that we'll come back to, but Representative Marquart, let's talk about local government aid, because that really has been a pretty hot topic. So Governor Dayton has proposed protecting local government aid for the cities that currently have it now. Both the House and Senate tax bills have offered cuts to LGA, but in different ways and differing amounts. Here with the TwinWest Chamber, many of our cities either don't receive LGA or are planning to end LGA in the current budgets because of the volatility that's been around that. And so just your thoughts on LGA and the impacts of the taxpayer and the business community, and also I think the kind of interesting dynamic of the difference between kind of the metro and greater Minnesota and how that plays out.
Well, thank you, and that is a great question. I'm a strong supporter of local government aid. It's the great equalizer. You know, you've got in our property tax aids and credit system, you have some equalizers. Local government aid goes out and equalizes among tax bases in communities. So in rural Minnesota, which gets about 2/3 of local government aid, and as the senator mentioned, in many of those communities, local government aid makes up a half, 2/3 of their budget. And without that, they would have to increase property taxes 2 or 3 times or cut services to the same level. And so in rural Minnesota especially, it is vital for equalization. And it really is the only property tax relief or service strengthener for businesses in rural Minnesota. It's the only thing that really gets back out to businesses in rural Minnesota. As far as in the metro area, the other big equalizer is the property tax refund program. And about 70% of those dollars go into the metro area. So you have so I see them working in tandem. You've got local government aid that goes out and equalizes among tax bases. And then where you still have property taxes, property taxpayers getting hit, the property tax refund program comes and tries to level that off among people and ability to pay. You know, 45% of all business taxes are property taxes. And in the last 8 years, property taxes on businesses in this state have gone up 50%, $800 million. And in the House tax plan, property taxes are going to go up another $80 million in 1 year for businesses. And I talked to a lot of accountants, talked to a lot of small business people, and you know, personally, I'd like to see all business taxes lowered because they're regressive and they fall on the consumer. Corporate income tax and property taxes. But when I talk to accountants and so forth, they say, you know what, if we didn't have a good year, or the business didn't, we don't worry about the income tax. We don't worry about the corporate tax. But one we cannot escape, or one we can't account down, is property taxes. And that's 45% of all the taxes on businesses. So local government aid helps buy that down. I know there's a lot of debate on that. I don't agree to the premise that it just increases spending. You know, if you look at local government since 2002, which really is when the recession started for them because of the volatility of local government aid, employees in local governments, non-education, has been cut by 7,700. And if you go out to communities, I'm a former mayor of Dilworth, in rural Minnesota, you haven't got a lot of frills. I mean, you have a police department, a street department, and those guys are taking care of the parks. You haven't got a separate park, and then you have your city hall staff, and that's it. And that's a city of about 4,000. You get down to a city under 1,000, you might have a half-time person that goes around, checks the lift stations and the pumps and so forth, and that's about it, half-time city staff. So local government aid is crucial, but it works in tandem in the whole equalization of property taxes.
So Mark, let me ask you, just staying on this topic a little bit, so, but I want to add one more data point to this. So there's this conversation about LGA and what the impact is then on property taxes and how those are interconnected. The Property Tax Burden Voss report, which was highlighted by a recent DJ Tice article in the Star Tribune, noted that suburban community taxpayers pay a larger percentage of their income in property tax than those in greater Minnesota. So how do you see that point kind of fitting into this whole discussion?
I think any discussion of LGA and related state aids to local governments has to begin with the premise of what this program is attempting to do. And we would argue it's not to equalize tax bases. That confuses purpose with tactics. Equalizing tax bases is a tactic. The purpose, I would argue, is to ensure that wherever you live in the state of Minnesota, you have access to important public services at reasonable tax prices. And if you use that as your basis for thinking about this, then the two paths which you have to look at are, we can subsidize institutions, or we can provide, refund and circuit breaker support to individuals who have an ability to pay problem. And, our organization has long advocated that the most direct and efficient way to accomplish that public purpose goal of affordable services at reasonable tax prices is through direct relief to individuals, not institutions. And I think the VOS database, this Homestead Property Tax Burden Report, emphasizes that, because what you do see is extraordinary differences in homestead tax burdens across regions of the state. Metro communities pay on average about 40% more on their income in property taxes than outstate Minnesotans. I don't doubt for a fact that as a result of these LGA cuts, there's property tax increase pressures in outstate Minnesota. But I do question whether or not we have crossed a threshold of an affordable tax burden, because from all the indications that we see, property taxes remain quite affordable for homesteads in outstate Minnesota on absolute and relative terms. Now, and on top of that, we would argue that even if property taxes go up, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Property taxes have long been recognized as the cornerstone of local government finance. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's transparent, it's stable, it's accountable, it's tied to local decision making, and those are all good things. The National Tax Association 70 years ago asked whether or not the property tax should be the cornerstone of local government finance. And I think 95% of the tax experts who comprise members of the NTA said yes. They did the same survey 70 years later. It dropped all the way to 94%. The property tax is not the boogeyman that everybody thinks it is. And frankly, our organization gets quite upset at the demagoguery oftentimes it's associated with beating up the property tax. It's a cornerstone of local government finance. It's a good thing. It gets people engaged in local governments in ways that no other tax can do, and we would argue that's a good thing.
So let's talk about another tax that's being discussed as we look at coming to an end of session here. So Governor Dayton has proposed increasing taxes on the top tier of income tax earners in the state to produce more revenue to close that gap. And actually, and I believe that the governor did take away, creating a new tax burden. It was the surcharge piece on that. So let's talk a little bit, and there has been a lot of different opinions on the effects of this and the value or lack of value in this approach. So let's talk about, obviously we're interested in the impact on the business community that we would have if we were to raise that income tax on the highest tax earners, and how does that trickle down to the economy, to the businesses, and to the employees of those companies as well. So Senator Ortman, do you mind starting us off on that one?
Well, I don't, but I'm going to take a moment to say that the Senate tax bill actually works to eliminate the statewide business property tax, because that was a new tax that was adopted in 2001, and that's the state intervening in those local property tax decisions, and we plan to eliminate that tax to help businesses drop their fixed costs of doing business in the state of Minnesota. We also had $44 million to add to the property tax refund program for the same thing. We understand that property taxes need to be addressed in the state of Minnesota, and that is the best way to encourage good relationships locally, is to allow the taxpayers and the property tax, or the property owners, to have a stronger relationship with their local elected official. About the income tax, it's not a very reliable estimate that we've got from the governor. Income taxes often can be avoided by smart taxpayers. If you get into a certain range, you're going to find a way a legal way. Some people would say the loophole isn't, but actually tax avoidance is not a bad thing. It's a smart thing to do. And folks in those income brackets actually have the ability to move their income around or invest it in a way that it will not be taxable. So the governor is relying on some estimates that are pretty static estimates about how much money will be raised if we actually increase our taxes to become tied for first place in the nation in terms of income taxes. So in addition to the fact that it won't raise nearly as much money as the governor is hoping, it also will drive businesses away. And you're all business owners, you all know, or employees in businesses, you've got finance degrees, you're running the show in these businesses, you know you have options. You know that the other states are far more competitive, and those income tax rates will drive Minnesota businesses away because 70% of Minnesota businesses are taxed on the individual income tax and not through corporate income taxes. And so folks can move their businesses to other states. They can find ways to move that income. And we, in our state, really need to encourage competitiveness. We need to encourage the idea that we are competing globally in our economy, that businesses are moving jobs to India and elsewhere to avoid the tax burdens here in the state of Minnesota. And so it's not acceptable to raise the income taxes here in Minnesota. Will have such a devastating effect on the economy. That's why we're trying to live within our means. We don't need to raise these taxes. All of our neighbors actually have much lower taxes. And so we will be firm about this. We are not going to raise income taxes to pay for more spending in the state of Minnesota.
So, Representative Marquart, do you see that this is a piece of balancing the budget that you support, that we should continue to push? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, since the last time I spoke, there's a number of things that have come up that I have to respond to. Because as the property tax chair the last 4 years, I've got to respond to Mark's comments on property taxes. The fact of the matter is, property taxes are a huge concern. $3.5 billion increase in the last 8 years, doubled on homeowners. And here's the bad thing about the regressive property tax, is that in rural Minnesota, we have 2 to 2.5 times higher percent of senior citizens. And they are on fixed income. Social Security has not gone up in the last 2 years. And they are ending up paying this regressive tax. It hurts businesses, it hurts farmers, but probably the worst thing is that the more you have to rely, and we're getting back to equalization, the more you have to rely on your local, then those that have high tax wealth, like a lot of cities down here, versus those who have lower tax wealth, creates huge disparities among the state. And I want to have one Minnesota, not two Minnesota. So in that regard, and we could go on more, but it has a huge impact. And the VOS database study looked at income, not property tax values. And if you look at property tax values and effective tax rates between the metro and the rural, it's almost the same. But going back to the taxes, the governor's tax, his fourth tier of 10.95, is not going to create this great exodus of businesses. If you look at migration studies around the nation that have been done, it is, in fact, I think you looked at that with individuals, it's very inconclusive on the impacts of higher tax rates. Because we tend to think, and we get into this rhetoric of taxes being the only thing that businesses consider. And we know that's not the case. There is education. And if you listen to the proposals by our state TOMs, they talk about the key is because the labor force is only going to grow 0.4% in the next 5 years. So it's going to come down to productivity. And we're going to have to increase productivity. And he has said the reason that Minnesota has always been on pretty much the forefront on the economy and businesses, and we rank #1 in per capita in Fortune 500 companies, is because we have a great education system. Now, we might be starting to lag a little bit, but there's education, there's infrastructure, there's all of these type of things. And when you look at the Dayton governor's plan, 16% of our 2.5 million income tax filers have business income. And 11% of that 16%, which is about 2% total, would be impacted by the governor's plan. And when you look at that, if you take someone making $250,000 under the governor's plan, the effective tax rate increase is going to be about 1%. The increase on income tax is going to be about 1%. And yet, if you look at the Senate's plan or the House plan, they cut the renter's credits, $52 million in the Senate plan and $96 million a year in the House plan. 28% of the people getting the renter's credit are senior citizens or those with disability. In rural Minnesota, 16 of our counties, that number is 50% or higher. And if you look at the effective tax rate of that cut, because the median income for someone who's a renter is just a little under $20,000. If you take the effective tax rate increase on that renter, on the average, is about 1.8 to 2%. And so you're telling me we can tax a senior or someone who's disabled at twice the effective tax rate as an increase as someone making $250,000? The governor's plan creates fairness. Both the Senate plan and the House plan makes our tax system more regressive. The governor's plan cuts regressivity by a half. And when you look at fairness, both the House plan and the Senate plan still says that if you're in the middle income or you're a senior citizen, you're going to pay 22 to 23% more of your income, the percent of your income in state and local taxes than the wealthiest. The governor's plan levels that out. It's fair. So if you're a senior, middle income, you're paying the same. And so there's a lot of different ways in which you can look at that, but the most important thing, too, with the governor's increase in revenue is that it invests in those things that I think are really important for business, and that's education and infrastructure.
So, Mark, some of the work that your group has done, what do you see as the effects of increasing this top-tier tax rate in the state?
The biggest, we've looked at a number of issues. We did some literature research to sort of see what studies have been done, and as Representative Marquart noted, the mobility issue, which everybody sort of seems to be focusing on, are the rich people going to be leaving? The research isn't particularly overwhelming with respect to a significant impact there. That said, there do seem to be some things that are worth paying attention to. One is that there does seem to be a strong relationship between higher marginal income tax rates and entrepreneurship activity. And there are business climate studies that are done, as you all know. Some focus on tax, some focus on broader issues. One of the better ones that we look to is the Kaufman Foundation State New Economy Index. And Minnesota ranks 42nd in entrepreneurship in the country. So that's a potential area of concern. The other thing that I think has direct implications for business is the wage effect of higher individual income tax rates. There's an abundance of literature that shows that, especially for high-skilled workers that are in demand, companies have to pay more to provide a competitive wage in higher income tax states than in lower income tax states. And these wage effects have potential implications for competitiveness. And you see that in some of these other climate surveys as well. One of the interesting juxtapositions that we see a lot when we look at these tax ranking studies and these climate ranking studies is that consistently, Minnesota continues to score very high on workforce-related issues, workforce productivity, workforce skills. As Representative Marquart suggested, we want to make sure we want to maintain that competitive advantage nationally. But at the same time, you see in the surveys that there's an increasing concern about the cost of labor in the state of Minnesota. And I think some of that may have to do with the wage effects as well. So from both an entrepreneurship standpoint and the cost structures of our businesses with these higher marginal tax rates and the competitive implications for securing the talent that we want in this state and need in this state going forward, I think those are the two primary issues we would be most concerned about with a higher income tax structure.
I'm going to go ahead and ask one more question here, and I just want to let Senator Ortman needs to leave at 10:02, so we'll let you answer this question if you need to step out. I want everyone to know that I believe the Senate is having their formal picture today, and we don't want the entire state Senate waiting for her. So, but be sure to tell them where you work. So one of the issues we wanted to talk about a little bit is former Governor Tim Pawlenty's 21st Century Tax Reform Commission. And there was a study that came out of that. Mark, you were on that commission as we announced. And there was a lot of really unique ideas that came out of that. We haven't seen a lot of action taken on those. There's been conversations. One of the things that came out of that was a structural change was looking at expanding the tax base and lowering the overall rate. And so the question, we'll start with you, Senator Ortman, since you need to leave, is does that make good fiscal sense? And are we going to see that still maybe as a part of the final negotiations here?
Well, I don't expect that they will be part of the final negotiations. I do expect that those conversations will occur going forward. I think it's very important that we resolve the budget first. And I think Minnesotans have sent a message to the legislature that the uncontrolled spending is basically like the legislature spending on a credit card, and the taxpayers are not going to bail them out. They want us to resolve that deficit with the 34.2 with the funds that are already paid, and we hear you loud and clear. And in fact, this morning the whole Senate is going to wait on the TwinWest Chamber of Commerce for that photo. And I'll tell you, there's nothing worse than being late for that photo. So I appreciate your letting me go a little bit early. You wouldn't have wanted to be Senator Warren Limmer the last time we took that picture because they had to bring him in the side door. People were really ribbing him really hard. So I don't want that to be me this morning, so I appreciate it. I wanted to say that we are going to get to reform, but that is the second and third portion here. Our first phase, you fix the immediate problem. That's what you would do in your business. It's what you would do in your family's budget. You've got a problem. You've overspent. What do? You balance the budget with the funds you have, and you don't borrow anymore, and you don't exceed your means anymore, and you resolve it with what you have. And then you make sure it never happens again. And that's why 34 members of the Minnesota State Senate signed on to that constitutional amendment that would say, going forward, we're not going to carry these structural deficits anymore. We're not going to rely on overly optimistic economic forecasts. And what's been happening is we have been budgeting to the very tippy top of the most glowing economic forecasts, even during very difficult times. And so we've spent all that way. If you remember the words of Milton Friedman, he said that government will spend every dollar that it can tax and then some. And that is exactly what has been happening in the state of Minnesota. And so our economy has been crippled by that inability at the legislature to make those tough decisions to live within our means. So we're going to live within our means now, and then we're going to go work really hard at some of these reforms, including making sure that our revenues come from the most stable and reliable sources, like the sales tax and not the income tax. That we try not to have regressivity. The corporate income taxes are absolutely the worst, and people don't really understand that. They say if you're making or providing relief to corporations through the income tax, then what you're really doing is helping businesses. No, you're helping the consumers and the laborers because those costs get passed down. And so we're trying to oppose the governor's proposals, not only the income tax, but he has proposed tax increases for corporations in Minnesota through R&D and the foreign royalties. We can't have that. We need our great Fortune 500 Minnesota businesses willing to reinvest here. They need to repatriate the funds that they earn overseas. And right now, it's way better for them to expand in Virginia or Indiana than it is to bring those dollars back from overseas and invest in Minnesota. And that's what we're trying to get at. We want them to expand here. We should not have a tax system that disincentivizes them to invest here. And so we are working very hard at that. I want to thank you again for inviting me. I want you to know that we are absolutely committed to your success. When businesses succeed in Minnesota, families succeed in Minnesota, and the entire state thrives. We know that you drive our economy. You're responsible for the economic growth that will help us out of this situation. And so we want to do everything we can at the Capitol to accommodate you, to encourage you, and to help you with your success. Thank you for having me here this morning. It's good
Thank
to
you
be here.
very much, Senator, for being here. Thank you.
I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see Senator Jen Olson doesn't want to be late for that photo either. So. All right, we are going to continue. So, Representative Marquart, so as looking at this expanding the tax base and lowering the overall rate, is that something that you see that makes fiscal sense?
Yes, and as Senator Ortman leaves, I want to really commend her because she's talked about tax expenditures this session, so I really commend you for that. And I do agree with that. I think, as Senator Ortman mentioned earlier, tax expenditures are the key. And we have $11 billion a year that is wrapped up in spending in our tax code, either in property or sales or the income tax. And you know, that's almost the same amount that we spend in education and health and human services a year. And what we can do is start looking at that. I mean, we should give that scrutiny like we give every other area of the budget. Stanley Surrey, a famous tax policy person, says, you know, if you haven't really addressed your tax expenditures, it means you don't have full control over your tax policy or your budget policy. The nonpartisan debt commission that President Obama had set up that came out with Simpson and Erskine Bowles, I think, they really looked at that. And what you can do if you go in there, because there's a lot of different areas that simply are not doing what they were intended to do. And in this time of deficits, we can't afford to be spending money that isn't going in the right places. And, you know, I know we talk and there's a lot of rhetoric here, and unfortunately, because of the budget system we have, you're going to get this partisan rhetoric. And that's because all the debate today has been on inputs. Not once have we talked about outcomes or results. And I think if you went to a price of government, zero-based budgeting with redesign and reform where you focus on outcomes and get better results and better outcomes at a better price, you would reduce a lot of the partisanship. You wouldn't be talking about this. You'd be talking about the achievement level of students or the condition of our roads. But I do think if we looked at tax expenditures, you could reduce the rates, reduce the deficit, and use some of those dollars to invest in productivity. You could do all sorts of things, and you know, there's $11 billion there. Just one of them, the mortgage interest deduction, just for an example, is $500 million a year. Canada doesn't have this, Wisconsin doesn't have this, and they have higher home ownership rates than we do here in Minnesota. So is it creating more home ownership? Studies show it creates, people buy a little bigger house. But when you've got 70–80% of those dollars going to the top 20%, it might not be doing. Just think of how we could use those dollars to use a whole different policy on home ownership or incentives. And yet, when Chair Lincheski looked at that a couple years ago, boy, did we get hit pretty hard on looking at that one. But we have to put some of these sacred cows out there and really take a good look at that. And that's the way in which we can solve our budget deficit, I feel. And I know Senator Ortman's talked a lot about tax expenditures, and I do think that's the key.
So, Mark, we'll have you kind of finish up here. I want to get you, and having been on the tax commission, and get you focused a little bit on the impact of expanding the tax base. So we're talking about expanding the sales tax to close services, but lowering the overall rate. You could do that certainly could do that revenue neutral. Does that create less volatility? What is the impact of doing that?
It absolutely creates more stability to your revenue system, which is a good thing. It also, doing it well, positions your tax system to respond to the demographic changes going forward as well. There's a general consensus out there that a shift to consumption-based taxation is almost inevitable, because origin-based taxation on business is just a non-starter in a global economy. And anything you can do, and even the evolution of the corporate income tax is almost evolving this weird sort of sales tax-like way. If it's not evolving particularly well, we would argue, but that sort of trend is in our future. It's not a coincidence that I think any number of countries have embarked on a value-added taxation, because they've sort of seen the realities of that, and if I had to look into a crystal ball, I would imagine that that's going to be in our future as well at some point in this country, because the realities of taxing income and capital is just going to be more and more difficult in a global economy. So from the standpoint of stabilizing the tax base, from the standpoint of positioning it for the future, those are all good things to do. On the issue of tax expenditures, I have to note, I think it's a great idea to do an examination or review of these sorts of things. The Department of Revenue has put together sort of a blue ribbon commission to identify how to reintroduce these sorts of things into the budget. It's a very thoughtful documentation. But I will add this: these things are irresistible as Fritos, because we do a bi-weekly bill introduction summary that we send out to our members. So we look at several areas of government, and including taxes, of course, and write up brief summaries of the bills and provide commentary. I can guarantee you, in every issue of our legislative spotlight this year, there are at least 6 new tax expenditures being introduced into the legislative process. For every one you want to get rid of, there are 10 more like dandelions you're going to have to try and pull out. So if you're going to gird your loins for taking on the tax expenditure budget, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I guess that's what I would say.
Well, I would like to thank you both for being here this morning. This was very enlightening. I think everyone appreciates the wisdom that you brought.
Thank you.
I do have, just before folks run off, we do have a couple last-minute details. Please save the date of Friday, June 10th for our next legislative breakfast. This will be our session wrap-up. Oh, wait, no, it won't. This will be our session, hopefully not midpoint review. I'm hoping this is our session almost done review on June 10th. Or who knows, maybe we'll have to eat crow, which would be good. We'd be done. So anyway, so please, June 10th, put that on your calendar. And also, don't forget to reserve your seat at the May 24th Small Business Awards Luncheon, where we will honor TwinWest entrepreneurs. TwinWest is pleased to have successful Irish restaurant entrepreneur Kieran Folliard keynote to the luncheon. We're trying to get little samples of his new whiskey, but I don't think that's going to happen. But in addition, WCCO's Frank Vassallo returns as the event's MC. It's a really fun event, so please go to the TwinWest website or stop one of the staff if you'd like tickets to that. And then also we want to thank a special thanks to Grand Casino Mille Lacs and Hinckley for being our series sponsor again, and all of this month's sponsors as well. So thank you. Have a great day, and the sun will come out tomorrow.
Yay.
Or Sunday.